Okay, let's get going. Hello, everyone. I'm Kent Lassman, and I'll be your host today for another in a series of book forums with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Today, I'm joined by a longtime friend of CEI and an important contributor of a genuine community of people focused on how to translate ideas into meaningful government reforms. He's shaped American government and culture. He's an award-winning journalist, contributing writer at The Atlantic, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, Mr. Jonathan Rauch. Forthcoming on June 22nd is his 8th book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth. Now, before we dive into the conversation, I have 2 quick reminders for everyone, as I do each time. First, the program is being recorded and will be made available on our website and at YouTube. We encourage you to share the presentation as well as to give us feedback, and you'll be prompted for that feedback at the end of the hour. Second, I want to get you involved in the conversation. I encourage you to use the Q&A function you find at the bottom of the screen, or during the hour, send an email to events@cei.org. And right here next to me, I'll see those questions come in, and we'll be able to get Jonathan engaged on your ideas and what you want to know more about. Now, by way of introduction, even though we're not quite halfway through the year, as I was telling a couple colleagues yesterday, this might be the most important book I read this year. At its heart, it's an explanation of the information chaos that threatens civic life and provides indications of how we can begin the process of regaining the systems and values that transform shared information into knowledge and truth. It's about knowledge. It's also about error and the values shared by a community. Throughout the hour, I'm going to try to let Jonathan do most of the talking. So I'll say thank you for being with us. And can you just start by explaining how you got down the rabbit hole of something as challenging as epistemology?
Well, that's a long story, but before I tell a very truncated version, of course, I want to thank you, Kent and Amanda and everyone at CEI. I think my relationship with CEI goes back to maybe when I was a summer intern in Washington in the 1980s and interviewed Sam Kasman, who is miraculously still there. So thank you for the work you've done over the years and the help that you've given me. You've shaped my outlook, and I hope maybe today for an hour I can maybe a little bit shape yours. The biographical element is that my specialty and my love as a university student was philosophy and history of science. And that immersed me into understanding where science actually came from. And it turned out it didn't just sort of come out of a lab one day. It was actually invented by a lot of people who did this very intentionally, because until then, people had settled disputes about truth and falsehood mostly by going to war and fighting each other or setting up totalitarian regimes or dictatorships or fiefs or principalities. And then they would divide into sects and they would go into war. And this was not acceptable to people. So along comes a guy named John Locke and some other people with names like Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and many others. And they say there's got to be a better way. And they create a liberal system for creating knowledge. And I got profoundly interested in that because I believe then and believe now, all these years later, that our system for creating objective knowledge, that's all the stuff in the libraries and all the stuff in the databases and all the stuff that if all humans died off, aliens could come to our planet and reconstitute our databases and decode our books, and they could use all that knowledge. It's much greater than any human individual. It's our greatest product. And I became fascinated with where that's, pardon me, with where that came from. And then the next thing that happened is starting in 1989, February of 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini, I'm sure you remember this, launched a fatwa, an international fatwa to cancel Salman Rushdie by killing him and by killing anyone associated with the publication of his book. And the response to that I thought was appallingly weak. People didn't understand what was going on here, which was for the first time, a non-state actor was reaching out across the whole world to chill debate, and to undermine this entire system we had found on. So I wrote a book about that called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought. And then I went away and did other things for a long time, like same-sex marriage. Along comes about 4 or 5 years ago, some strange things start to happen, like people start getting canceled online, they get fired, we see the rise of trolling in a massive way. We start seeing Russian disinformation. And then the really big one comes in 2016, when Donald Trump appears on the scene and begins applying Russian disinformation tactics to US politics, something no one had dreamed of even trying before, much less succeeding at spectacularly. And that's when I said, it's time to go back into this subject, understand the constitution of knowledge, which is the norms and institutions that keep our society in touch with reality, and understand its enemies and the techniques they're using. As you so well put it, information chaos. So I hope that wasn't a filibuster, but that's the whole story of this book.
Let me see if I can add something, and I want you to correct me if I've misunderstood. Because I'll confess, I read about half of the book on different nights after 11 p.m. and my comprehension down, later as we go. But right there at the end, you said something about keeping us in touch with reality. There's something I think really important, a thread through here. It's also keeping us in touch with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a discussion of how knowledge creation and preservation is necessarily community, shared, social. Could you unpack that a little bit? I think that's important before we get into all the other pieces of the book, to understand that essential element about the social nature of knowledge.
That's the core concept of this book. And I think the biggest advance in epistemology, the study of truth and knowledge and where they come from, in a number of generations. And that's understanding the social nature, really the network nature of reality. So what does that mean? Most of us as individuals don't know very much, and a lot of what we think we know is wrong. And a lot of what we think we know, pardon me, is we take it on trust from other people. We look at the weather forecast and we assume that NOAA is more likely to be right than wrong. But, we don't really know that. They could be a bunch of practical jokers. So it becomes very important to be in a community where people are seeking knowledge and information and facts in a way that's actually compatible with getting knowledge, information, and facts. Well, and it turns out for the first 200,000 years, we were doing that really badly, because left to their own devices without any structure, any guidelines, people are not actually that interested in finding truth on, abstract or broad matters. We're pretty good at a question like, is that a breeze in the bush over there? Or is that a tiger? Because our life depends on it. But on questions like, what will the weather be in a week? Or what God do we worship? We're terrible at that. And one reason is confirmation bias, which you know all about, which is we look for ideas, hypotheses, and even perceptions. We subconsciously favor the ones that confirm what we want to believe. Things that enhance our prestige in our group, things that are consonant with our identity, our politics. And we're not even aware of this. We can't find it. We can't see it. And the second big bias is conformity bias. We're like little walking consensus meters. We want to harmonize our beliefs with the people we care about. And we do that unconsciously too, but it means we're very influenced by the people around us. And you see, Kent, how these things work together. Individually, we seek information that confirms our biases, and then we prefer to talk to other people who share those biases, and then we confirm each other's biases, and pretty soon we're going down complete rabbit holes of unreality. We're splitting into sects, we're going to war with each other, we're stagnating societies, and we're losing touch with reality. And that's pretty much the first 200,000 years of human history. So how do we get out of that? That's the constitution of knowledge. That's the system, very much like the US Constitution, that protects us from our own worst instincts and channels us toward consulting each other in pragmatic and productive ways instead of unrealistic and uncivil ways.
I want to pick up on that theme about the parallels with political, economic, knowledge-based systems, constitutions. Before we get there, a preliminary question, particularly in the first half of the discussion, and again, as you conclude, you talk about the professions that participate in the creation and defense of the constitution of knowledge. These are the scientists who use the scientific method, and they publish their reports and their evidence to be critiqued by others. Journalists, academics, statisticians, economists, discussion of the intelligence community that collects information about the way the world is. And they all adhere to these values of checking the empirical data. Is participation in your constitution of knowledge, or as you frame the constitution of knowledge that we share, that is under threat, is that only for these elite professions, or is it democratized? Is it widely available to everyone, regardless of station or profession or what country you live in? And I think that that's something that wasn't missing, but I went looking for.
That's a great question. Could I come to it through first saying a word about what we're actually talking about when we talk about the constitution of knowledge, what people are doing that makes it special?
Let's do that. It's this great counterintuitive system, as you described.
Yeah,
So what is maybe that should have been my first question. What is the constitution?
Yeah, and then we can talk about and should talk about who it applies to and when we use it and when we don't use it, which is equally important. So there's some basic rules of the constitution of knowledge, which are not unlike the US Constitution. The US Constitution is basically at its fundamentals. It does a lot of things, but basically what it does is force compromise. It distributes power, and it says everyone's going to have to use certain rules and negotiate with each other using those rules to get an outcome, which is usually a law or getting power in an election. And it shouldn't matter who you are. You get the same vote. You have the same power, and then it disperses those powers in a lot of ways that makes it very hard for any one individual or faction to seize control of the system. And it says, go out there and negotiate with each other. And you have to do that even if you don't want to. That's a breakthrough. James Madison thought of that and systematized it. No one really had before. The notion, and the core notion there, is that ambition counteracts ambition. You pit people against each other in what turns out to be a cooperative process. It's incredibly sophisticated and ingenious. So constitution of knowledge has the same basic idea. Suppose, for example, Kent Lassman wants to establish a proposition as a fact. We'll call it the sky is blue, but it could be anything. Well, one way for him to do that would be to impose that by killing people who disagree with it, or banishing from the tribe, or imprisoning them, or doing a lot of other things which historically have been done. Constitution of knowledge says, no, there's only one way you can make knowledge. Only one way. You're going to have to persuade other people, and you're going to have to do it according to these impersonal rules like empiricism, fact-checking, that work for anybody. You can't just say, well, I'm Kent Lassman, I'm in charge, so here's the rule. Whatever you say is the right way to check your idea has to be something anyone else can do. So I have to be able to replicate the experiment. If I'm a journalist and you're writing an article, I have to be able to check it, go out to sources. Is this really true? And only at the end of this process of everyone checking everyone else, and it is checks and balances, does knowledge emerge. Only then, once you pass through that whole process, are you entitled to say, okay, my idea belongs in the textbooks. It's not just my opinion anymore. So that's what the constitution of knowledge is doing. And like the economic system and like democracy, our two other big liberal systems, it scales fantastically well. And that's totally unique. This is a system which organizes literally millions, hundreds of millions of minds around the world to work on problems like the vaccine that went into my arm 2 months ago that's now protecting me against COVID. This can organize truth-seeking, error-checking on a global scale. And it's increasing geometrically every year in extent and depth. Developing countries are now coming in big time. The number of publications that are internationally co-authored went up in the US. like 20% over just 10 years recently. That's how that vaccine happened, right? People harnessing their intellect all over the world
Well,
through a
I think
decentralized cooperative process. So that's what we're describing.
there's something right between the lines there that you almost said, and I think it is true. It's not only that this Madisonian insight scales fantastically, that you get more researchers looking at a virus when you have a global research community rather than a national research community or a corporate research community within one company. Uh, it's that it becomes more stable and more powerful and more ingenious as you scale. So Madison's central challenge was he looked at democratic organizations, the Swiss, Sparta, like everything he could find, he studied it, and they'd all failed. And rather than trying to unpack that, he said, what if we make it bigger? We think of America as a bigger place with pluralism and tolerance as a central.
Yeah. Madison's just an incomparable genius. And one of his astounding insights is all these democracies had failed because eventually some faction, a majority faction or a minority faction, would take over. And he said, so the answer to that isn't to make it smaller like Rousseau. He called it extend the sphere, diversity, pluralism, make it bigger and bigger so no one faction can take charge. And that's also a very good description of what I call the reality-based community, which, if I can, I'll go back to the question you previously asked before I detoured, which is, so who's in this network and who is it for? There are four big ones, but lots of others. The big four are the research and science and academic communities. Of course, they're the long pole in the tent. The second is journalism, meaning mainstream reality-based journalism. The third is government. That's everything from the regulatory process that you guys know so well, which requires a showing of facts and then contest all those things. That's the intelligence agency, it's NOAA, it's the CBO, on and on and on. It's very important to have a fact-based government. And the fourth, which we tend not to think about, is law. The concept of a fact actually originated not in science, but before that in law. And that's what courts do. And it's what lawyers do. They argue cases, they're adversarial, they have citations, they find facts. And those are the things that define our ability as a society to stay on the same page most of the time. We're not all part of that every day. Francis Collins, one of the greatest scientists on the planet, the head of the National Institutes of Health, developed this vaccine, but he goes into church. He's a very devout man, and he puts on a different hat. Key to liberalism is, we don't have to apply the US Constitution in our family life or in our church or synagogue life. It's for public life, but we keep it there. In our private lives, no, we don't all have to go around being Mr. Spock and running experiments. And we shouldn't. But when it comes to public facts, like I might believe that Elvis Presley is still alive, but do we send him a social security check? The answer is no, and that's because the reality-based community has determined that he's dead.
You've alluded to a couple times here, and I want to make sure that we make absolutely clear. Simple rules here can make for a very rich, robust, complex system. And you have two essential rules for the Constitution of Knowledge about no final say or the idea of fallibility and no personal authority, that we have to be doubtful, which is different than skeptical, which rests a little bit more on cynicism. Could you make perfectly clear what you mean by these two essential rules?
Yeah, I'll try. If you could boil all of what I call liberal science, which is this whole network, this whole system we have of figuring out what's true, down to two rules. There are those two. The first is the fallibilist rule, no final say. And that means that knowledge, no one can say knowledge and the search for knowledge is completely over. A fact can be well established for 400 years, and that's very important. We don't start from scratch every day. But at the end of the day, no one is entitled to say, you know what, I have the truth, you don't, shut up. It's over. No more conversation. Because we all might be wrong. And that's fundamental because it makes the system open-ended, like the economic system. or like our democratic system, there's always another election, there's always another transaction, and we always might be wrong. That gives us humility, and that creates a culture where everyone is always subject to checking. The mightiest people on the planet in this system have to be checked because they might be wrong. The second rule is the empirical rule, and that's no personal authority. And that means whatever you do to check a proposition has to work for anyone, regardless of race, color, creed, nationality. You know, we can certainly have individual earned authority that comes from, you know, winning a Nobel Prize or whatever. But it's no good for me to make an assertion and say that only atheistic homosexual Jews can understand this truth and you can't, and therefore you have nothing to say about it. And that keeps us all on the same page. That means suddenly you can have this global system where everyone's basically playing by the same rules. If I demonstrate a proposition, if I write an article in a journal or a magazine and say this is true, someone across the planet, someone in China, some scholar or journalist should be able to look at it and say, I see a flaw in this argument. And I can't say, well, you're Chinese, you don't get to do that. I have to answer that. And those are both revolutionary concepts. And that's at bottom what gives us this system. Now, as with the US Constitution, it's very important to say, Kent, as you well know, that those basic rules are just the starting place. The real magic, and what this book is really mostly about, is all of the stuff that you have to build on top of that. Like most of the US Constitution isn't written down, you know, like judicial review, popular elections, the political parties. It arose afterwards, and all the norms, like, you know, if you lose an election, you admit defeat and you accept the legitimacy of the loss. A lot of stuff like that. Same is true of the Constitution of Knowledge. We have to be willing to accept when we lose an argument. We have to not bullshit. We have to not manipulate the evidence. We have to try not to silence our foes. And then we have all of these literally hundreds of thousands of institutions. I named some of them, but everything from the intelligence agencies and NOAA to the great universities, the research institutions, the New York Times, the entire media ecosystem, the journals, the fact checkers, the conferences, the professional organizations. All of that stuff is where the actual work of making knowledge is getting done. It's not just like an unstructured, open marketplace of ideas where everyone's always talking to everyone. That turns out not to work. It's all these nodes and centers like CEI, where people are working through ideas, trying to find the best ones, and then passing them on elsewhere in the system. That's how we do it.
Well, before we get into any questions that we're going to get from the audience here, I want to ask you, I want to press on this a little bit, because there's a couple points throughout the hour where you know, I wake up, there's sunshine on my shoulder every day. I'm an optimist. And there's a couple points here where I made notes in the margins, and I thought, well, is Jonathan wearing rosy glasses? And so you tell this wonderful story about a scientist who had to stand in, he had the opportunity to stand in front of a conference of his peers and explain how he had made an error that had been widely accepted by the community. And rather than be castigated, he was applauded, because these were people that were seeking truth. It was a truth-seeking community, this scientific community. I do want to get into the notion of falsification, and I think you have a very nice treatment of the ideas of Karl Popper that we should spend a moment on. But are you wearing rosy glasses when you look at the scientific community and the identification of error, and we look at journalism or politics? I can't quickly think of an example where a politician who admitted a major error was rewarded. Typically, they receive the opposite.
Well, politics has very different incentives than the reality-based community. And that's the second half of my book, because right now, the reality-based community is under assault from the world of politics. And we should talk about that. So that's not the comparison to draw. But examples of error seeking and error checking, yeah, all the time. And a big one right now, there's a huge conversation going on in the media about why the media messed up on the lab release, the lab escape theory of coronavirus. Too many people made too many assumptions too quickly and followed each other, and too many other voices were lost, and too many people in the media got it wrong. But guess what? There's now a national conversation on why did we get this wrong? And that's a defining characteristic of the reality-based community. People hate to be wrong, and they hate even more to admit that they're wrong. And we don't expect people to walk in and say, well, I don't really know, maybe I'm wrong, because we want people to have very strong beliefs and defend those beliefs. That's what gives us the strong arguments that we need. It's like Madison, you don't want people in politics who are all just, oh, I don't know, taxes go up, taxes go down, doesn't really matter. You need these strong opinions. Yeah, there's none of that at CEI. You need these opinions, but then you need to pit them against each other. And all you really need to have happen is at the end of the day, people have an ethos and say, well, I may still think I'm right, but if the community out there decides that my theory doesn't hold, I lose the argument. Now that's the key thing, because in the reality-based community, you don't lose your head, you don't lose your freedom. And unless you've performed professional malfeasance, you don't lose your job, you just lose the argument. And that frees people to do the critical element of good science and journalism, which is make even more mistakes even faster and then find those mistakes. That's the magic. It makes mistakes very quickly. And we punish each other's mistakes instead of punishing each other.
And that's how we sidestep the credo wars of the past, is by focusing on the error of thought or the error of evidence, not the person, not their
Correct.
family, not their...
As Popper said, we kill our hypotheses instead of each other.
So who is Karl Popper? Tell the audience about Karl Popper, and like I said, I think there's a very nice treatment of some of his most important ideas for the lay reader in your book.
Karl Popper is a philosopher of science, and I think one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And he's the guy who said, well, it is true that we never verify anything for sure, but we can falsify things for sure. Like if I have a hypothesis, all cats are black, that'll be hard to prove unless I see every cat. But if I see a white cat, I know it's false. So maybe what science is really doing every day isn't so much verifying, which is what people always assume. Maybe what it's doing is actually falsifying. It's trying to state propositions in ways that are coherent and falsifiable, and then see if anyone can knock them down. And it's like evolution. You call it evolutionary epistemology. At the end of the day, the survivors in that process are our knowledge. There are problems with his view, and people have modified it, but it's still a very fundamental insight, and it's still a unique feature of the reality-based community of liberal science. And in some ways, it echoes like what's really unusual about capitalism. Well, companies fail. That's not really allowed in the Soviet Union, or if you're a state-owned entity in China.
Okay, I just got a note. We're halfway. So a reminder to the audience, I'm going to keep going with questions until I get your input. And to really start to stir things up a little bit, I want to get into, Jonathan, you have a chapter each on some significant threats. And you label them one primarily from the right and one primarily from the left in contemporary society. These are threats to your constitution of knowledge, to the world where we have a shared reality about what is true. From the right, could you spend a couple of minutes talking about disinformation and trolling? And this is going to lead us right into former President Trump and how the 2016 unfolded for everyone.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Again, if I may respond to that by just stepping back a minute and introducing a concept. So the system that we've been talking about sounds great, and it develops vaccines, and it means that we can debate abortion and talk about things like sonograms instead of just killing each other. And that's all great, but not everyone loves that system, because if you're a demagogue or a priest, or you want to create a cult of personality, or you're a hostile foreign power, or you're just a nihilist or an anarchist, you don't like all these constraints and you don't particularly like being told what's true or false. And you seek to undermine this system, and you realize something that friends of this system often forget, which is it's not just an open marketplace of ideas where all you need is freedom and knowledge will spontaneously emerge. There are lots of these institutions that we've been talking about and lots of these norms, tons of structure all the way through. And those are all targets. You can't undermine the whole community, but you can go after the soft institutional targets. So what does that mean specifically? I'll introduce a concept: information warfare. Russians call this active measures. Some call it propaganda. Whatever you call it, here's how I define it. This is organizing and manipulating the social and media environments for political advantage, and specifically to dominate, disorient, divide, and or demoralize a political opponent. Now, this is not about finding truth. It's an entirely different world. It's about dominating the information space and making your opponents feel helpless, confused, dividing them from each other. This is what Vladimir Putin was seeking to do in 2016, what he's so good at, what he did in Ukraine. There are lots of ways to do this, and they're very sophisticated and effective. And what they have in common is they play on these cognitive and psychological flaws that I alluded to earlier, like bias confirmation. So there are a bunch of them, but in the book, I focus primarily on two. And is now the time to lay out what those two are?
Yes. Let's.
All right.
I think you're going to, by explaining what these two areas of focus are on that point, you're probably going to drive up sales. People are going to want to hear the rest of what you had to write about it.
Yeah. The first part, the stuff we've been discussing, which is granted a little abstract, is the part of the book that I think, conservatively will be read in 1,000 years, maybe 1,000,000. The second half, though, is actually the applied stuff, the current crisis, which is really what's drove me to write this book and what I think people really need to understand right now. One form of information warfare is to, as Steve Bannon, who is an advisor to Trump, a strategist, called it, flood the zone with shit. Censoring people is really hard, especially in the social media age. It's not very effective. But what you can do is put out a tsunami of lies and conspiracy theories and half-truths and just sheer nonsense at such a high rate that no one can possibly keep up with it. And the fact checkers get lost and the media get lost. And if they rebut it, then they're giving it more airtime and spreading it. But if they leave it alone, it just spreads even further. It doesn't have to be true. In fact, it can be completely inconsistent with itself. It can be like Trump saying, this literally happened. On one day, he said that impeachment proceedings were depressing the stock market. The very next day, he bragged that the stock market had reached record highs. Well, he doesn't care. Putin doesn't care. The Russians do this with an almost what's called a carnivalesque glee. And the goal here isn't necessarily to persuade people what's not true, though, of course, it's nice if you can do that. It's to demolish trust in the system so people become completely disoriented. They're hearing so much stuff from so many sides, pumped out through so many channels that they don't know what's true. They don't know who to trust. They become cynical and disoriented. The press, the mainstream media, the people who are supposed to check this stuff get overwhelmed. They don't really know how to deal with it. And it's just spreading all over the place. This is a tactic that we need to get very familiar with because although it had been applied with great success by the Russians, no one came along and said, hey, why don't we take Russian-style disinformation, fire hose of falsehood, this tactic is called, and why don't we, here at home, deploy it against our fellow Americans on a massive and unprecedented scale from the Oval Office, through conservative media, the Republican Party, and every other available channel. So Trump, in his 2016 campaign, PolitiFact is checking both candidates. 25% of what Hillary Clinton says is mostly or entirely false. That's too high, but people who know politics won't be that surprised. 70%, 70% of what Donald Trump says in the campaign is mostly or entirely false. He's more likely to be false than right. He gets to be president. First day, he lies about the weather during his inauguration, says it doesn't rain, hadn't rained, it did. He lies about the crowd. What is that? What's up with that? You know, that's not going to persuade anyone. People who were there saw that it rained. We know the crowd side. This is about pumping out so much garbage so fast people can't keep up. And that's what he does. He's clocked it by the Washington Post as something like 36,000 lies through the course of his campaign. And the rate significantly accelerates. The whole curve takes a big jump in April of 2020. What happens in April of 2020? You're probably ahead of me on this. The Stop the Steal movement gets started. He begins testing the waters and organizing the networks for what is going to be a massive disinformation campaign the day after the election, because he knows he's likely to lose the election. So he starts pumping out the notion that mail-in voting is a fraud. And people like me and maybe you go, well, that doesn't make sense because a lot of Republicans vote by mail. That could hurt him, you know, especially during a pandemic with older voters. He's not focused on the election. He's focused on the post-election. He's creating the message and the network, and then he pulls the trigger the day after the election, and 75% of Republicans now believe the election was stolen.
Let's pause there for a moment, because like a journalist who builds fact upon fact, like bricks in a wall, you articulate this case that you've just outlined for us, and you make a direct parallel to a trolling incident that most people probably didn't pick up on. Many more people were watching politics, and so could you walk us through? Because I don't think we necessarily have to leave the discussion of Donald Trump, but I want to make sure that we're understanding the whole story.
Yeah, I know what I'm saying sounds partisan. I know what I'm saying sounds partisan. I really don't think it is, because I want to. But yeah, you're right to. It's very important to broaden beyond Donald Trump and his base and say these are tactics that can be used and have been used by any ideology. Lenin, Goebbels, Russian troll farms are doing this all the time.
So let's pick up on that. The story about a Louisiana gas leak and how, testing months in advance of use. How does that parallel with what you've just described about April 2020?
So the specific incident here, the first of a number of them, this weird thing happens on September 11th, 2014. Word spreads online that there's been a giant explosion in a chemical plant in Centerville, Louisiana. And this is tweeted out by individuals with names and faces, and there are photos of it. And then there's video of it on YouTube. And there's even a Wikipedia page put up on it. And sure enough, it spreads like wildfire. And then the local media calls the local authorities, who call the chemical plant. And the chemical plant says, there's been no explosion. And the local authorities write this off to a sad and sick hoax, someone with a sad and sick sense of humor. We didn't know it at the time, but that was a test run coming out of the notorious Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. And everything about it had been invented. And this was Russians testing our information networks to see what could they spread and how quickly. They do it again 6 months later. I didn't get this in the book. You run out of space. Jade Helm. This is an operation that's run, it's standard military training exercise in the American Southwest. And it's all published, right? I mean, there are maps and everyone's supposed to know what's happening on certain days. And it's no mystery. It's been going on 14 years. But weirdly, these rumors start to go viral online that this is going to be a coup d'etat in which Barack Obama will take over the government and take away everyone's guns. And this spreads like wildfire.
What you're describing, Jonathan, is it's not just someone, in off the grid living in Idaho that believes this conspiracy about a coup d'etat for President Obama. This is something that is spreading through the infosphere of American life.
Correct. To the extent that in Texas, the governor of Texas actually issued an official statement saying that he was mobilizing the state guard to monitor Jade Helm to make sure it wasn't a coup d'etat. That's how far it got. But the other point you just made is just as important. We tend to think, well, trust is down in institutions and the public's divided and lots in social media and things have gone wrong, as if this were some kind of natural disaster. This is not a natural disaster. I mean, that's part of what it is, but a lot of it is specific individuals and organizations who we can actually name who are disrupting our ability to find truth and agree on reality on purpose.
So I have a question here from, again, it's getting us into this applied space, applied use of the ideas you have. Question from David, who's wholeheartedly behind your 2 rules about fallibility and no personal authority. But he asks that once a policy is in place, we immediately have vested interests and a community of people who fight to save that policy. How do we ever overcome policies that are based on bad information and then they have developed a vested interest behind them?
That's my other book, which is Governments End: Why Washington Stopped Working. And that's about a different sphere, which is the world of public policy and law, which is once you get a program on the books, it's very hard to change. And interest groups form around it and protect it. And the whole system we've been talking about until now, Kent, is trial and error. You try a hypothesis, system tests it. If it's wrong, you try another one. Well, we can't really do that with government programs because once they're there, they tend to last forever and then they just accumulate. And except for moments of extraordinary growth like the present, when you can add to the pile primarily through debt, you know, we're kind of stuck with our first try at Medicare. It's very hard to change. We have changed it. The answer to that question takes us outside this book and into the other book, and that says, actually, we can manage this process of accumulated programs and policies. We can't forever fix it, but we can manage it by ensuring more competition in the economy. Trade is very good at putting pressure on special interests, and regular efforts to reform and rationalize these programs can pay off and often have. And that's, can I say this, why CEI exists.
You may say that, absolutely may say that. But one more question on this, because I introduced this topic. I want to turn to what you have described as primarily a problem on the left with cancel culture. There's some great anecdotes. You did some reporting, it looks like, on campuses talking to students. But we have a question here from Todd, and I'm going to share part of it, and I'm even going to extend it. He asked, what do you make of the fact that a 2018 poll found that 2/3 of Democrats believe that Russians literally hacked computer systems and changed vote totals to help Trump win, or that so many Democratic leaders have endorsed Stacey Abrams' claim that she lost the gubernatorial race in Georgia because of suppression and fraud, although there's been no evidence. And I would extend that. I don't think the question is just about, you know, both sides do this, but there's been this trajectory. I remember the horror that I felt in 2001 when prominent Democrats, who I thought were very sensible people, thought that George Bush had stole the election. And the term of art was illegitimate. And this came on the heels of what I thought was the most statesmanlike thing Al Gore ever said, was a concession speech in December. He said, "This is the way we do things. Sometimes you lose." Very, very clear articulation of the political application of this sort of test, that there are norms that matter. This illegitimacy, this concern about just making claims without evidence in the political sphere, it does seem to be ramping up. And I wonder if you have anything to say about the 2/3 of Democrats that they believe that the Russian trolls hacked computer systems, which we don't have any evidence for.
Correct. Yeah, thank you for that, because it's a very good reminder that conspiracy theories, false beliefs are a human problem, not a partisan problem. And it is correct that Stacey Abrams was hyping some false claims about the election in Georgia in ways that did actually, what's the word, premonition? There must be a verb for that.
She was prescient?
she pioneered tactics that were harnessed in a much bigger way by Stop the Steal. So it is important, and thank you, that these tactics themselves are not partisan. I would, however, distinguish between ordinary false political beliefs, which people have always had, and that, as you know, Kent, that goes back to the 1800 election, when all kinds of smears and slurs were used, and people were saying that, Thomas Jefferson had done this and that, some of which, by the way, unfortunately turned out to be true. Those things, with how does the rest of the information ecosystem react to them? Is it trying to correct them, or is it trying to amplify them? In the case of an on-purpose disinformation campaign, you're deliberately sucking up these bad ideas and broadcasting them without any regard to truth or internal consistency. A fire hose of falsehood is a disinformation campaign, and it's intended to amplify these false beliefs. And it's important not to amplify them. It's important to try to tamp them down. We in mainstream media, I'm a journalist by training, by profession, we do try to tamp these things down. We don't always succeed, and we don't always do a very good job, but that is the goal. And that is a very different goal from what information warfare is trying to do, which is the opposite.
So tell me about, let's spend just a moment on cancel culture and the imperative of speech and diversity of ideas, being able to have voice. You build the case for why this is a problem and a threat for the constitution of knowledge. You also open the door near the end to some positive signs, like the statement out of the University of Chicago, some things that coming out of Purdue University. So walk us through that set of ideas that you've developed in the book.
Yeah, it's not just campuses, but I think a big message of this book, something that people haven't thought about, is that the fire hose of falsehood and other tactics that we're seeing Trump and his supporters use are very different in political motivation and methodology than chilling and canceling and social coercion, which is primarily used to very different ends on the left. But they're both forms of information warfare because they're both trying to organize and manipulate the social and media environments for political advantage, as opposed to actually trying to find truth. So canceling, a new term, it didn't exist when I started the book, but I adopted it. I called it coercive conformity, hacks a different part of our cognitive sphere. Remember, people follow other people. We look around our environment to figure out what's true. And if everyone's saying X is true and X and Y is false, and not only that, Y is so dangerous and stupid that you shouldn't even say it or think it, we'll be very influenced by that, subconsciously, consciously, both ways. So suppose you can hack this environment by using tools like social media and shaming and investigations if you're on a college campus, pressures on employer to fire someone, massive pile-on, demolishing someone's reputation. Suppose you can use tactics like that so that Kent Lassman will steer clear of any conversations that have anything to do with, say, race or sexuality or gender. Then you chill Kent Lassman, and so you like that because you're trying to dominate the information space, because that's what you're seeking to do. But you do more than that. You cause rampant over-chilling and demoralization, because Kent Lassman, because a lot of people are being silenced, Kent Lassman no longer knows what other people really think. So he looks in the environment and everyone is saying one thing, and so he thinks, well, maybe that's true, and maybe I was a terrible person for believing the other thing. Minorities can use this tactic actually to essentially dominate majorities. And that's what happens now frequently on college campuses, where you get minorities of activists, small groups. And people are just very afraid to cross them and no longer know what it's safe or unsafe to say, because the last thing a canceller wants to do is create a safe harbor. Instead, they want to chill the whole environment. They want to lay landmines all over the place so that you could blow up for anything. They want to demoralize you and chill and make people afraid to speak. It's not just on campus. This is not just an academic problem. There are now so many examples that it's, you can't begin to recite them all, of online canceling, and people are now going after other people's jobs and succeeding. Polls now show that 1/3 of Americans are afraid of saying what they really believe about politics for fear of losing their job or a job opportunity. And what's really interesting about that is equal across all political, all ideological groups, from very conservative to very liberal. Progressives are also chilled and they're also afraid.
So
And that's a really bad environment for truth.
One of your admonitions is that we all need to develop thicker skin. Are we just particularly bad as a people at talking about politics? I remember the old, cliche about the dinner table. You don't talk about politics or religion. Is there something special about controversial topics that make it so we don't know how to talk about them? It would seem to me the answer is no, but
so this is why you need a constitution of knowledge, right? Because people are naturally reticent about making enemies, losing friends. That's super important to humans, because if we don't have friends and allies, we starve to death. So our natural instinct is to associate with people who agree with us and to agree with the people around us. And what the Constitution of Knowledge is protect us from that by saying, no, you have to be checked with people who disagree with you. And it's also okay to disagree. The core of the Constitution of Knowledge, like Madison's Constitution, is pluralism, diversity of viewpoints. Science doesn't work if everyone has the same viewpoint, because then we're just confirming each other's biases. So what you've got to do is pull in more and more viewpoints and have an organized controversy. But that's really hard to do if you're in a social system like, say, certain liberal arts colleges that I could mention, where people are just afraid of, what could happen to their reputation if they speak out. What will they get investigated? Will their course evaluations be marked down? What if I'm a student? Okay, well, I'm a moderate progressive liberal. I do have my doubts about affirmative action, but I'm sure not going to open my mouth until I graduate in 2 years. So a lot of this is, I do emphasize individual bravery. That's very important, but it's equally important. You've got to keep two ideas in mind. We also have to create a context in which bravery can be supported, and that means counter mobilization. This is public choice theory. If small organized groups can outvote and outmaneuver and outmanipulate large unorganized groups every time. So those of us who are against canceling and want a more open environment need to begin coming to the rescue, the support of people on campus and off who are at risk of being canceled. And that's now happening. In fact, I think we're at a moment of real change for the better, because a lot of groups are forming that are doing exactly that. And I think that's going to change the equation.
These are both kind of individually driven. You also have discussion, and I want to relate it, or at least start to address something from the audience. I remember a couple of pages in the book, right in the middle, you talk about the potential for new institutions and the institutions that can develop norms that contribute to this constitutional knowledge. And specifically, I'm thinking about the Facebook Oversight Board and its implication for other social media and how people engage with that. It's been in the news the past week. Where do you see the development of institutions in the Constitution of Knowledge?
Well, it's critical. And one reason is what I just said. People can't do the right thing or are afraid to do the right thing if they don't have institutional support. But it's important for another reason as well. This isn't the first major information disruption that's happened. The inventing of the printing press was a huge one and led to incredibly bloody wars across Europe. The invention of the penny press and then offset printing in the United States led to the development of an extremely partisan media that was full of fake news, the yellow press it was called. So how do we get out of these traditionally? Well, we build institutions and norms that train ourselves to find and meet better standards of behavior and incentivize those better standards of behavior. For example, about 100 years ago, people in the media business realized that their system is toxic, that they're driving away readers with the fake news and with the hyperpartisanship, that they need to do better. So they begin setting up journalism schools. The Association of the American Society of Newspaper Editors forms. The first thing it does is promulgate some ethics codes, which then are spread through the journalism schools. You get the development of journalism prizes like the Pulitzer Prize, but also many others, which incentivize news gathering according to rules. You get conventions like, if you make a mistake, you need to correct it. You can't just move merrily on and pretend it didn't happen. So it actually only takes a few decades from the early 20th century to, more or less the time of the 30s, the 40s, World War II, when we've got, Edward R. Murrow, to transform journalism into something that's reality-based and pretty darn reliable. So fast forward to today, Facebook is doing something very much like that with its oversight board. People are cynical about that. They shouldn't be. Setting up these institutions that provide some norms and guardrails and guidance that other people can then buy into and other institutions can buy into and say, hey, maybe this is a better way of doing it. That's how we solve it in the past. And that's only one example. I have others in the book. Wikipedia has succeeded in doing this. There's now an International Fact Checkers Association, which is beginning to build in some guardrails. This is how we do it. This is what works.
This is where we might have a difference of confidence on near and long term, or near and intermediate term. I
agree with you, actually.
I'm quite optimistic that there's tremendous potential for these institutions, like the Facebook board. You have a nice discussion of PolitiFact and what it's done in the last 15 or 20 years. But there is clearly, for reason, with evidence, PolitiFact is oftentimes more political than fact. And that becomes a problem when we try to build reputational value. The New York Times, in its reporting, not in its editorial, clearly carries water for an agenda, a political agenda on certain topics. And that tears down that reputational value, and it's something we need to work on socially, collectively. And I want to thank you for taking those things on, with or without the rosy glasses. If you have the rosy glasses, I won't complain, because we have too many cynics out there.
Well, as we say goodbye, I want to say something that's just so important. If you walk away with nothing else, I am not arguing for complacency. I'm not saying that these problems automatically solve themselves. The very opposite. We're in deep trouble right now. We are dealing with massive campaigns on the left and on the right to undermine our ability as a society to understand and find truth. And we don't necessarily win that war. We've got to understand the system we're defending, and then we got to defend it. Because if we don't, it does collapse, and it's already under extreme strain, starting to collapse. So I'm not urging complacency, but I am saying that there are hopeful paths ahead if we have the fortitude and the wisdom to pursue them.
One of the most important features of the book, and I want to remind people that it comes out in just another week or so, June 22. You can find it. Politics and Prose, I believe, is carrying it. You can find it on Amazon for pre-order. I don't know why, but maybe I'll have to ask somebody over at Brookings. They have not sent me a box to distribute to CEI supporters, and maybe they should.
I will be more than happy to connect you to make that happen.
One of the most important features of the discussion here is the humility that you bring to the idea that you might not be correct. And that itself is an attribute of someone seeking truth. That itself is something we all need to emulate in order to build this constitution of knowledge and defend that constitution of knowledge. Jonathan, I want to thank you not only for the last hour visiting. It was nice to catch up in the little electronic green room beforehand, but also for all the work that you put into this book. I look forward to seeing you as soon as all of the shutdowns stop here in Washington.
Kent, I've enjoyed the conversation, and I'm grateful to it. And I'd like to hope that what we're doing today is one small part of the repair work that needs to get done.
I think it is. I'm going to remind everyone else as we log out here that we have other events on deck. Tuesday, the 29th, we'll have a discussion about price controls and whether or not it's a constructive way to lower prescription drug costs. In addition to our own Greg Conko and Joel Zinberg, Richard Manning and James H. Wilson will be joining us. Richard from Intensity LLC, and James Williams, former special assistant to the president at the Domestic Policy Council. And then after the holiday, we'll be back for another discussion about the future of ESG investing, featuring Richard Morrison, Andrew Studiford, Jennifer Schulp of the Cato Institute, Justin Danhoff, and all of that is going to take place on the 6th of July. Last note, a reminder to everyone, As we log out, a prompt's going to show up on your screen, and we take very seriously the feedback that you provide. So I look forward to your comments on just 3 or 4 questions, and the 5th, open-ended, telling us what you'd like to see or more or less of in the future. With that, we are adjourned.